Okay, so I've been seeing a lot of discussion online recently of fantasy weapons and armors, particularly from channels like Shadiversity, who I need to be clear again. I like this guy. I just think he tends to be inside his own bubble a little bit too much. But you know what they say, be the change you want to see in the world. So I figured I would make a video series at least talking about different fantasy weapons, but more from the perspective of what they're supposed to symbolize within the story. So less the practical uses of these weapons and more why does Randolph Thor wield a sword where Perrin Abara wields a hammer? What is the author trying to tell us is the difference between these characters by their weapon choice? This is something that's kind of difficult to talk about because ultimately it's down to your own preferences. This is, art after all. To that end, I want to talk about what I think is the most iconic weapon in pop culture and fantasy, and that is the sword. I mean, as an actual history, for actual history, I don't think the sword was practically used very much. Just based on what I've heard, spears tended to be a little bit more common, spear and shield. That tends to be a more effective, military formation. But it's enduring in pop culture for a particular reason, and I think the story that at least popularized our modern conception of the sword more than anything else is the legend of King Arthur. I mean, who doesn't know the basic story of King Arthur? Uther dies, the sword is left in the stone, and there is a prophecy that whoever pulls the sword from the stone shall be the once and future king. This, to me, seems to be the quintessential sword story in that it's a story about a legacy. It's about somebody who, depending on the story context, it's worth noting that Arthurian legend never really had any sort of canon, and really any interpretation is just as valid as any other. Arthur didn't necessarily even know that he was Uther's son. So he pulled the sword out from so he pulled the sword from the stone, and that allowed him to embrace his legacy as a king and a knight, and so from that point on, swords have always kind of had this thematic resonance with a legacy, adopting a legacy, or getting or receiving a legacy, or depending on the context, a broken legacy. Just look at Star Wars. It should be no great mystery that Luke Skywalker is mostly based off of King Arthur. I mean, the guy receives a sword from a wizard and goes off on a holy quest to destroy the evil sorcerer. It's not that. This shouldn't be a surprise to a lot of people. And in the very first movie, he gets that sword, which is his legacy. It was his father's sword, and he wanted you to have it. Okay, look. Can you tell they totally retconned that shit in the second movie? Even in Empire Strikes Back, when Vader cuts off Luke's hand, spoiler alert, he thematically severs that legacy by saying, "No, Luke, I am your father." So in the next movie, he builds his own sword, creating his own new legacy. Fairly simplistic look at this. Honestly, I think the more interesting thing about Star Wars this is in the sequel trilogy, in which this scene in particular, where Rey and Kylo are fighting over the sword. See, to her, that sword is the sword that represents the legacy of Luke Skywalker, her childhood hero, the man who defeated an empire. That Luke Skywalker. To Kylo, it represents the sword of Anakin Skywalker, Darth Vader, the darkness in him, and all of that. And it's an interesting way that you can look at this. This is the sword of two different people who have two entirely different legacies. To Rey, it means the light. To Kylo, it means the dark. So since I guess we're on the subject of Star Wars, this is something I constantly see in a lot of Star Wars extended media, is the holding of a sword in a reverse grip. Yeah, I am no expert at swordplay. I could safely say I know almost nothing about it. I can safely say that holding a sword in a reverse grip is not very effective. The most important thing in a lot of swordplay tends to be reach. Well, in a lot of medieval weaponry, tends to be reach. If your enemy can't get close to you, they can't hurt you. And holding a sword like a reverse grip is like you have to swing out like this And that's like super low reach and kind of really hard to hit. And honestly, it's kind of unintuitive. You point really well, and that's like what you're fundamentally doing with the sword. But imagine if you were trying to point with your pinky finger downwards. That's the kind of thing that seems like it'd be difficult to do. But I don't feel like that's the point. When you watch Clone Wars, you might notice that the character of Ahsoka constantly holds the sword in a reverse grip, and I feel like that is fundamentally because this movement, which is common, or movements like this that you would have to do to anyway try and even remotely hit someone with this sort of thing, which again is probably a very bad idea to try in real life, is fundamentally the same movements you see when you're trying to block your face, right? So it's a defensive movement. It's meant to invoke a sense that this is a person who is trying to defend things more than they are trying to attack things. It's somebody who cares for defense more than attack. Probably not a really very realistic understanding, but that seems to be the point. That the characters are constantly moving and deflecting in ways that are defensive, which weirdly I've always felt like kind of clashes with Ahsoka's style of, having two lightsabers, which always to me came across as kind of like a berserker style, somebody who cares way more for attack than defense. Even in like the game Skyrim, dual wielding weapons, you can't block with that, which has always been kind of ridiculous, but whatever. Though, since we're talking about dual wielding now, I guess we might as well move over to the Forgotten Realm and everyone's favorite dark elf. Not me, actually. I found it to be somewhat pretentious, but Dritz Do Erden, who is well known for his double saber style in a lot of fantasy settings. And I feel like the interesting thing about this style story, the Dark Elf Trilogy in particular, is that because Dark Elf weapons are fundamentally part of the Underdark, they disintegrate when they're up above ground. I feel like that works very well for Dritz's character development because it allows him to symbolically sever his familial connections and legacy of his family and go back and go into the great unknown. His legacy crumbles in the sunlight, I guess is what I'm trying to say, and that's a good thing for the character because he is not like his kin. And I feel like that's kind of a necessary element for the character to grow in such a way. Though, since we moved back into more of a fantasy setting, let's talk about the cloud that somewhat looms over all fantasy settings in this case, Lord of the Rings. Yeah, the most famous actual sword from this is probably Aragorn's sword, Nadrasil, the Flame of the West, and I probably mispronounced that. Okay, so the sword is shattered by Sauron, right? At the beginning here. And that's at the same point where the legacy of the kings of Gondor kind of gets shattered as well.
Into the fire! Destroy it!
No. He takes up the ring, and there hasn't been a king in an age. And at the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring, Aragorn kind of inherits this sword, this broken legacy, and it's up to him to more or less reforge that legacy and be the king that Isildur never ever could be.
I would have gone with you to the end.
So the reforging of the sword here is more meant to represent that kind of return of the king. Now, throughout this entire video, I have made speculation about what some artists were intending when they did these sorts of things, but maybe I could just be reading into what George Lucas intended with the sword and what Rian Johnson meant to do in The Last Jedi. But with Tolkien, I have a very hard time believing he did not realize exactly what he was doing with the broken sword here. It's like, this is the kind of guy that has a detailed backstory behind every tree branch. So he knew what he was doing with Aragorn inheriting the broken sword here. Since we're back onto classic fantasy settings, classic in the sense that everyone's heard of it, but nobody actually reads it, let's talk about the Wheel of Time, in particular Randall Thor. So, if you've never read the Wheel of Time series, the main character is a guy by the name of Randall Thor, and he inherits a sword from his dad, Tam. But very early on in the first book, you realize that Tam probably isn't Rand's real father. And it takes a while for him to fundamentally accept that, but I feel the point where he fundamentally accepts that is in the end of the second book. It's 14 books, people. I have to spoil something. Where that sword, which was supposedly unbreakable, breaks. That legacy that legacy of father to son that you thought was unbreakable breaks. And this is the moment where I feel like Rand sort of realizes that Tam was never his real father. He seems far more accepting of that fact after this point as well. So I think Robert Jordan probably intended this, although we can never ask him. So there's that same kind of broken legacy. And within the same series, there's a people known as, the Aiel. So there's like this super warrior culture people who create the best warriors on the planet and everything. I mean, it's difficult for me to describe it as anything other than fantasy Dune. They spend their whole lives in the desert, and that makes them super tough and everything. So, fantasy Dune. But they refuse to use swords, and it's difficult to talk about this too much without spoiling it, but there are a people who are fundamentally spurning their legacy. They're spurning their ancestry in certain ways, and they're rejecting the weapon that best represents how their ancestors did. There's no swords being passed down from person to person in the Aiel cultures because they want to. It's really difficult to talk without talking about it, but I think but anyone who's read the books knows what I'm trying to say, I think. Let's say this: the Aiel are rejecting a certain part of their ancestry or their legacy that they would rather not have. So they refuse to use the weapon that is best associated with legacy. Though if you know what I'm talking about, maybe you could see how this might kind of not work, and that's what I'm going to talk about next. Some things that I see constantly done with swords that I don't necessarily like. And the first one is the double-bladed sword, or the double-sided sword thing. Yeah. So, like, Darth Maul from the first Star Wars movie. The first. Episode 1. It's the fourth movie. I get that it's kind of trying to be sort of a bow staff looking thing, but it's too high-tech for that, if you ask me. The double-bladed lightsaber to me kind of sends mixed messages because like the staff is supposed to be a weapon of, the common person just picking up a weapon because, we've had it this, too much. We're meant to invoke like an idea of I'm a simple wanderer, that kind of thing. And, this clash with advancement and this kind of clash with like the legacy of these... of the legacy of the dark side with the primitive aura of the bow staff. It just never really worked for me. And any sort of fantasy variant I've seen of this kind of has that problem too. It's just like, this doesn't really work, if you ask me. It's a confused message is what I'm saying. And speaking of confused messages, I really don't like it when Wonder Woman has a sword. I feel like her typical armament of the armbands and the lasso are good enough, and the sword, and then giving her like a sword to fight with kind of feels. I guess it works in the first movie where she has to like realize she is the god's killer, that that kind of thing. But I gotta say, I don't really like that that interpretation of Wonder Woman. I've always liked the older interpretation where she was literally sculpted from clay and not actually Zeus's child. I don't know, just it's a unique origin, and I've always liked the lasso more as her signature weapon because it's like fundamentally a weapon meant to subdue people. It's almost like she's meant to represent compassion or something. The bracers to me have always kind of represented that kind of I'm taking something used to shackle me and using it to protect people kind of thing. That improvised weapon feel to me. I don't know. I just never really liked any depictions of Wonder Woman with a sword. It's never really worked for me because I feel like it thematically clashes, if that makes any sort of sense. And this is something I do feel like needs to be pointed out, that this is fundamentally from a Western viewpoint. I'm not the biggest Japanophile, I guess you would say, but from what I've seen, how do the Japanese tend to view the sword from their cultural standpoint, it more or less seems to have a similar feel that that a revolver does in the American mindset. It's meant to be the weapon of the old-fashioned hero. In their case, it In Japan's case, it was the samurai. In America's case, it was the cowboy. So it tends to be tied up in a lot of those I fight for old-fashioned stuff. Old-style hero, Bushido, and all that sort of thing. And that's just my impression of how the Japanese tend to treat swordplay. But yeah, that's the sword. It is a versatile weapon for explaining for a metaphorical background of the history of your main character. It usually means that a character is inheriting a legacy of some sort, but it can also represent their broken legacy in some instances. Sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse.
You know what would come in handy against a monster made of dough? Some sort of sharp implement. Oh, if only you had a sharp implement, David. If only.
There's no need to be sarcastic.